The demo for Fire Emblem Three Hopes has been out for a week and a half now, and in that time I've had the opportunity to play up to the end of what's available for trying out in all three routes. Ahead of the full game releasing this coming Friday, I wanted to share my thoughts on the content of the demo with everyone else so we can all bask in that sweet pre-release hype. There will be spoilers for the story content in the first 4 chapters of the game, although that shouldn't come as a surprise. I will not, however, be discussing any gameplay elements, because frankly, Warriors combat isn't exactly my cup of tea. It's all a little too chaotic, and too much going on at once for someone more used to turn-based gameplay, so I'll leave those conversations to people who actually enjoy that sort of thing. This video, and other videos on Three Hopes that I'll inevitably be making in the future, will be treating the game more like a visual novel, because those are the parts that are appealing to me. And really, there's so much to discuss on that front. Right from the start, Three Hopes distinguishes itself from Three Houses in the presentation of its avatar. Shez is still a gender-variable self-insert with a player-chosen name like Byleth, but unlike Byleth, Shez has a voice and emotions and an identifiable personality that may not be the most developed in the world, but is still leagues ahead of what Byleth was. I say was because, even though they've only appeared in a single scene so far, Byleth too has been improved in the transition between games. It's actually believable now that they're a cold and dangerous mercenary worthy of the title of Ashen Demon, and not the little level 1 commoner that can get killed by prologue bandits like we saw in Three Houses. There is still some artificiality to these avatars stemming from how the player chooses their names and genders, but that's still vastly better when compared to just how much of the writing of Three Houses is warped around its player self-insert. Because, at least judging from the demo, that element is also gone from Three Hopes. Byleth as the embodiment of player choice affects the writing of Three Houses in transparent and often illogical ways. The life or death of some characters depends on which class Byleth chooses to teach at the start of the game, and other elements like recruiting students to different houses rely entirely on characters' relationships to the self-insert rather than anything more grounded in established characterization or in-universe concerns. Granted that there's still plenty of time in Three Hopes for Shez to impact the plot in a major way, but up to Chapter 4 it really seems as though the game is telling a single cohesive story from 3 different perspectives. The timelines for the routes don't match up exactly, like how Chapter 4 of Scarlet Blaze takes place before the same chapter in Azure Gleam, but at least up to that point they're all headed in the same direction. It's not only the lack of self-insert focus that elevates the writing of Three Hopes over that of its predecessor, however. There's a lot more showing rather than telling when it comes to the characters' political maneuvers, helped greatly by the fact that significant players like Count Gloucester and Count Burgleys are no longer kept off-screen but actually get to appear and engage directly with the other characters. NPC interactions are no longer confined to the monastery, but are more spread out in the style of other mainline Fire Emblems with villager NPCs to help on the maps, and a separate base camp for each route. I would have preferred if the camps each had their own look and layout instead of being the same apart from the music and the house banners, but I'll take what I can get. The action moving around Fodlan also provides a better sense of visual storytelling than what Three Houses had, and the behind-the-shoulder perspective of Warriors games makes that easier to appreciate as well. Did anyone seriously play Three Houses with its weird zoomed-in combat camera? I could never manage it. The addition of all these NPCs and a better sense of geography allow the world of Three Hopes to feel more fleshed out and slightly more lived in, much more so than a bunch of text dumps in library books, even though those are still present too. Of course, it shouldn't come as a surprise that no characters benefit from these changes more than the house leaders, and I just have to take a minute to praise all 3 of them. Let's start with the one that's benefited the most. I could never get behind Edelgard's writing in Three Houses, because in that game she's both a sympathetic villain in the vein of past Fire Emblem antagonists like Arvis, and the most heavily marketed love interest. Those 2 concepts don't play well together at all, and Edelgard's characterization suffers significantly as a result. So much about who she is and what motivates her is obscured behind vague backstory events that never get elaborated upon outside her supports with Byleth, or her deliberately unclear actions as the Flame Emperor in White Clouds, all of which is promptly forgotten about come Part 2. So much of what she does throughout the game can be hand-waved as the work of her Agarthan allies or her murderous minions Hubert and Yuritsa, which robs her of much of her agency in the effort to keep her palatable as a romantic partner. Crimson Flower is not written as a villain route, much less a revolutionary one, but rather as a love story, which is why it has so many unsatisfying elements like how no one ever questions Edelgard or forces her to grow as a character in any meaningful way, or how she remains allied with the Agarthans up to the end and only deals with them in the postgame, in another instance of Three Houses telling and not showing. Crimson Flower doesn't really care about the war Edelgard is waging. It just wants you to reach for her hand, insert the rest of the lyrics of Edge of Dawn here. And for someone like me who is immune to the charms of any and all waifus, that makes it basically impossible for me to connect with Edelgard on any level. Three Hopes Edelgard, though? Without the self-insert fixation, and with a lot of the fat trimmed off her character, Edelgard in this game is more active and engaging and, dare I say it, interesting. There's no Flame Emperor disguise, no school mystery. Her new declaration of war doesn't mention crests at all because that element never worked very well if you thought about it too hard. She stabs her Agarthan allies in the back by Chapter 3, initiates her reforms in the Empire, and then still declares war on the Church and starts invading the rest of the continent. She pushes back against Hubert right from the start to enact a plan of her own, which adds some welcome friction to their dynamic and really makes you feel like she's the one in charge of their plotting. The ploy with installing Count Varley as the bishop of her restored Southern Church is a brilliant instance of her playing her opponents against each other. Especially if you go with my theory that it's actually Hubert staging failed assassination plots against Varley to vilify Rhea and justify the Empire's invasion of Garreg Mach. Again, that's brilliant, and because Hubert is one of my favorite characters, any opportunity for him to be even more of a smarmy, murdering bastard can only be a good thing in my book. I also like that Edelgard's restoration of the Southern Church takes her war in a direction analogous to the Protestant Reformation, and the wars of religion in Germany, France, and other countries, because that feels more appropriate for an early modern European-inspired setting. Yes, Edelgard is absolutely still a villain, and even more obviously so now, because declaring war on other nations to share your enlightened ideals is textbook imperialism, but she carries that role very well, and I look forward to seeing where it takes her. I have less to say about Claude, although I'm still enjoying him in Three Hopes. Claude's biggest problem in Three Houses is that Verdant Wind is about 90% copied over from Silver Snow, so it never properly feels like Claude's story. It's just Byleth versus Edelgard, only with the Golden Deer and a different final boss this time. That's not the case with Golden Wildfire, which from the beginning looks to be focusing on story elements specific to Claude and the Alliance. They're still reacting to Edelgard's aggression, but in building up a secondary external conflict with Elmira that's going to touch Claude more personally, the story of Golden Wildfire has room to go in different directions. We also get to see more of the inner workings of the Alliance political system, which was, again, kept entirely off-screen in Three Houses, and Claude expresses his frustrations with the need to work within that system in a way that calls back to a conversation he has in Verdant Wind. Except, in that game, it doesn't feel as impactful because it only resolves in Byleth becoming king or queen of a united Fodlan. Golden Wildfire develops the mutual antagonism between Elmira and the Alliance, touches on how the Deer have more commoners in their house and how those characters feel out of place among the heirs to the Great Houses, and is the route that most builds on Shez's identity as a mercenary and their desire to get revenge for their fallen friends. There's a lot to work with here. All that stuff is great, but now I get to talk about Dimitri. Three Houses was quite kind to Dimitri in the writing department, gifting him with a solid character arc and the route with the fewest glaring flaws in its writing. Azure Moon is not perfect by any means. It's still got issues with the self-insert, after all. But given a hypothetical scenario where you could punt Byleth out of the story, Dimitri hits all the right notes you'd expect of a well-written Fire Emblem protagonist. Funny thing about removing Byleth, that's exactly what happens in Three Hopes, and Dimitri ends up with even better material to work with as a result. We get to witness firsthand some of the political fallout from the tragedy of Duscur and the years of civil war in Fargus that followed, and how Dimitri is faced with the challenge of navigating the shifting loyalties of the kingdom nobility, and reckoning with his now more power-hungry uncle. There's a more substantial resolution to the Duscur genocide storyline than there was in Azure Moon, which leads into the kingdom restoring Duscur and now having Duscur soldiers fighting alongside them. Dimitri's decision to support the Central Church against Edelgard is much more fleshed out than the similar scenario in Crimson Flower, showing that the kingdom nobles are not religious zealots, but rather have pragmatic reasons to support the Church that also happen to align with their desire to not be conquered by the Empire. Through all of this, there's also more development for Dimitri's established support network, whether that's Felix coming into his own as Duke Fraldarius, or Rodrigue taking a more active role both in the story and in gameplay, or Dedue, just Dedue. Yes, I am the guy with the half-hour-long video where I squee over the intense homo-romantic subtext between Dimitri and Dedue in Three Houses. And yet every time I think that canon can't make these two any more obviously in love with each other, while still sporting a veneer of plausible no-homo deniability, Three Hopes surprises me yet again. Dimitri audibly hesitates over the term vassal when introducing Dedue, which is both a callback to their Three Houses supports and the very definition of queer coding, framing a queer relationship or queer identity in a non-queer context to make it more acceptable to outsiders. And then there's this line from Dedue, and really, I know it's a meme, but there's no heterosexual explanation for a man saying this about another man. Where can their two support conversations even go from here that doesn't just spell it out explicitly? I don't know, but I really want to find out. And that's not even the extent of it in Azure Gleam, because there's a wealth of new subtext between Dimitri and Felix and Sylvain, and now even Sylvain and Ash have an A support. I want to know what's up with that. Evidence for Fargus's great gay polycule only continues to mount, and I found myself instantly missing that male homo-romantic core when I moved on to playing Scarlet Blaze and Golden Wildfire. Of course, Monica is incredibly gay for Edelgard over in the Eagles, but for me personally that's just not the same for fairly obvious reasons. Regardless of how Three Hopes turns out overall, I will absolutely be making a video in the future celebrating the abundant queer subtext of Azure Gleam. And if you're new to my content and you're surprised that this is what I'm focusing so heavily on, just know that gay stuff is kind of my specialty. Someone's got to talk about it, right? And I will be talking about it, among other things, after the full release of Three Hopes. I would not expect any Let's Plays from me because, again, I'm not in love with Warriors combat, so I'm not confident enough to show myself muddling through the gameplay to the general public beyond what you're seeing here. I am thinking about a summary video on each route as I finish them in the weeks after the game releases, and after that I'll just see where the discourse takes me. The calendar for my channel is pretty clear, at least up until August, so I'll have a good few weeks to devote to picking apart Three Hopes. Thank you all so much for watching, and be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more Fire Emblem content from me. Also, tell me in the comments what you thought of the Three Hopes demo, and what you're most looking forward to in the full game. Au revoir.